Alright, so welcome to the 14th video in this series on orchestration. In the last video, we were introduced to the percussion section. We discussed the various categories that each instrument can be sorted into, and even addressed a few specific instruments that have special considerations that we need to be aware of. In this video, we're going to hit two birds with one stone by covering both common playing techniques and a useful strategy to use when writing for the percussion section. So with that, let's get started. First up, let's take a look at a few basic playing techniques, starting with the flam. A flam is when the percussionist performs a single grace note, right before the accented note. This grace note is used as an embellishment for the accented note and can be used to give a little more character to the sound. Closely related techniques include the drag, which has two grace notes, and the four-stroke ruff, which has three grace notes. Each of these techniques is found most commonly on membranophones, like the snare drum or the bass drum. Next up, we have rolls and swells. The roll is sort of like the tremolo equivalent for percussion instruments. In fact, it is very often notated using tremolo markings in your music. When dynamics are added to a roll, it becomes a swell, and swells are particularly useful for helping to build up to climactic moments in your music, especially when performed on cymbals or deep drums like the bass drum. Finally, the last technique we'll cover in this section, it's not actually a technique at all, but it is still very important to acknowledge, and that is mallet type. Now, there are different types of mallets that can be used to strike a percussion instrument. In general, the harder a mallet, the sharper the sound it will produce. Generally, if you don't have a very specific idea in mind for what you want your percussionists to use, it's best to just simply defer to their expertise and let them choose which mallets that they're going to use on their own. However, if you do have a specific idea in mind, you can use various figures drawn above your staves to notate which mallets to use, and when. Just make sure to include a key on the instrumentation page of your score, to let the conductor and the musicians know which mallet the figure stands for. Common mallet types include hard tip, medium tip, soft tip, brush, snare sticks, triangle beaters, and hammers or mallets. And that pretty much covers all the techniques I wanted to mention in these videos. Obviously, this isn't a very exhaustive list, but there are plenty of resources available online if you want to learn more about individual techniques. For now, I want to spend the rest of this video discussing a very specific strategy for actually approaching the percussion section as a whole in your music. So traditionally, the percussion section has 7 general roles that it plays in orchestral music: doubling for color, ostinati, extreme dynamics, solo statements, highlighting accents, builds and climaxes, and harmonic support. These 7 roles can be remembered with the acronym DOES-HBH. Whenever I'm writing music, I tend to save the percussion for last. I'll write any particular parts that I have in mind earlier on, but whenever I feel like I've reached a good point to call my first draft complete, I'll re-listen to the music multiple times while focusing on each of these roles one at a time. First, I'll look for opportunities where I can use percussion instruments to add additional color to any point in my music. The percussion section has many unique tone colors that can be used effectively in countless different contexts. One common use is to double other instruments with percussion to add a little more attack to the sound. Once I'm ready to move on, I'll look for opportunities to add ostinati. And if I'm being honest, this one is actually typically taken care of much earlier in my writing process. The percussion section is very frequently used to provide rhythmic ostinati as a foundation that other instruments can build on. And this isn't typically something that I have to wait very long to come up with. However, I'll always check just in case a fresh perspective gives me some new ideas. Next up, I'll check for moments where either end of the percussion section's extreme dynamic range can be useful. As mentioned in the previous video, the percussion section boasts of both the quietest and the loudest dynamics in the entire orchestra. From the barely audible ting of a single chime to the just unchallenged might of a bass drum, there are countless opportunities to add to the presence and atmosphere of your music. In particular, louder dynamics are very useful for climactic moments and for crescendos, while quieter dynamics can add tremendously to the texture and the mood of your music. The next role, like ostinati, it will typically have been taken care of already. But I like to go through and re-listen to any moments where I think the foreground or the midground could benefit from a solo performed on one of the pitched percussion instruments. Some of my favorites are the marimba and the vibraphone. However, like I said, solo statements are typically covered much earlier in my composing process, and I don't typically add any additional ones this late into the game. If I do anything at this point, it's usually just to swap out one solo instrument for another. Next, we have one of the most common roles of the percussion section. I'll go through my music and look for any important accents, or any moments where I want just a little extra attention or energy. And then I'll check if there are any particular percussion instruments that I can use to help add to these moments, like a well-placed cymbal crash, or a drum hit, or even just a single chime on a triangle. After this, I'll look for closely related moments, where I want to add a little extra oomph to a crescendo, or maybe a bit more attention to a build. In other words, I'll look for appropriate moments where a well-placed swell can be used to build energy, and a well-timed crash can announce the arrival of a climactic moment. If I'm not working with this kind of material, I'll look for moments where a well-orchestrated swell can help bring down the energy level of my music, by starting out nice and strong and gradually growing quieter. Finally, I'll listen to it one last time and pay attention to any moments where my background feels a little too flat for my liking. If I find any, I'll try adding some arpeggios to the mix, using pitched percussion instruments. These in particular are very useful for adding a little extra life to your music. And by then, I typically feel pretty good about my first draft, and I take some time away from the project to just freshen up my ears and approach it again with a more objective point of view. So, just to summarize, some of the most common playing techniques for the percussion instruments include flams, drags, four-stroke roughs, rolls, and swells. Each of these helps to add a little extra color and life to your music. The 7 traditional roles of the percussion section include doubling for color, ostinati, extreme dynamics, solo statement, highlighting accents, builds and climaxes, and harmonic support. These roles can be remembered with the acronym DOES HBH. And with that, we finished yet another video in this orchestration series. I hope you found it helpful, and if you'd like to be alerted when the last 2 videos of the series are released, please like and subscribe to this channel. And also please share these videos with anyone you think might find them useful as well. In the meantime, thank you again for your continued support. Keep working hard, keep studying, and as always, keep writing new music.